Hello and welcome to today's live stream. We are dancing, we are having a good time, and we're going to be talking about focus stacking with our friend Fuji Chris. Less than 2 minutes until we kick off. Do me a huge favor and let me know where you're joining us from. Hello, hello, hello. I hope you are having an awesome day, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining. Let's see who we have here so far. Looks like Mr. Mike Vrobel, who is a Fuji shooter, member of the Ohio Fuji fam. And if you haven't joined, if you don't know about the Ohio Fuji fam, just go to Facebook and type that in, and you'll be able to join our group of just Fuji creatives, where we share, we give you a weekly challenge. There's support there. It's just an awesome community of creatives. So if you haven't checked that out yet, do us a favor and do yourself a favor and join up with that group. Who else do we have here? Tech Gear Talk, also another kind of Fuji user from time to time, specifically with some gimbal work. Mr. Tech Gear Talk, I hope you are having a great day. And sorry about your drone that I broke. Robert Kiwi, Bob from Shaker Heights, hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Who else do we have here? Les Greenberg. Hey, TJ, been doing a lot of stacking with the G9. Do it with Zareen. Interested in this webinar. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad that we hit on a topic, or we're going to hit on a topic that you are currently working on or want to learn a little bit more about. So you didn't come here to hear me talk. You came to hear from a good friend of mine, Mr. Chris. How are we doing, sir?
I am doing fantastic. I cannot say, if you're having a bad day, all you got to do is listen to that startup music.
Yeah,
and that's literally it.
It just energizes you so much. Love it. Love it.
Oh man, I appreciate you inviting me back. I know I've done a few of these already, and I love how nerdy we can get and stuff we can explore and kind of get new ideas. And that's really what we're here and what we're about. And I appreciate the opportunity. I know that I say that every single time, but I really, truly mean it. And you might hear my kiddo in the background. She's playing around today right above me. So if you hear someone screaming, they are not in distress. They're just having fun.
Having a good time.
Right.
So I love this topic because you apologized several times. You're like, I'm sorry, but we're going to get geeky. We're going to get nerdy. And honestly, I say let's do it. Let's commit to it, because I think that, especially with all the other online education that's been happening, it's been, kind of just dipping our toe in a little bit.
Right.
And you're like, no, like we're putting the Speedo on, we're jumping into the deep end, we're gonna make it happen. So what is our topic today? So share with us. I know we have the title, with getting started with focus stacking, but give us a little preview of, what exactly focus stacking is, and then we'll get your screen up here and get kicked off.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of go over what focus stacking is as part of the presentation. But our goal today is to kind of go through it's going to be the basics, but I'm going to take an approach of, what it is. I'm going to go why we choose to do it. So we're going to get alternatives. First, we're going to decide whether we need to do focus stacking and some of the elements behind it. Then we're going to go into the how in terms of camera base. Then we're going to go to the post-processing element. And we're going to, just dip our toe in that, because I know I can spend 5 hours on it. If I really wanted to do it, I could just load these images right now and wait for you guys to align it up for me while I'm drinking my coffee. But I'm not going to do that to you. I have everything prepped. But that's really the fundamentals of it. I mean, there's a lot to it. Obviously, there's multiple aspects. I know, Mike is fantastic with his food photography here, and he's probably been experimenting with this. And I know that he's probably been having challenges like I have, and how a lot of people have, in terms of, getting this to work appropriately depending on what lenses you have. And we're going to kind of discover that and kind of choose kind of the best opportunities and the best options lens-wise, camera settings-wise. And we're going to go pretty in-depth into the Fuji realm of that, because obviously that's who I work for. But we'll have some of the options, like, the gentleman said he works with the G9 there. You'll be able to use those images, kind of use some of the options that I've been using, and you can kind of determine what process you really need to do. And we'll learn computer-wise some of the fails that I've had, and imagine what other people have had, because there's a lot that goes around with that.
Excellent. Well, let's get your screen up here, and we'll get it started. So we did have a couple comments on aspiring food.
Yeah, that's what I like to hear.
Mike Vrobel, Chris, love the quarantine beard.
You like that? You should have seen the hair a couple weeks ago.
And then I get into a death match with Photoshop every time I do focus stacking, and Photoshop is winning.
Yeah, I got a little tip for you, Mike. I've had the same thing, and we'll discover that later on. We'll go into like setting up scratch discs and stuff like that, and Very fun, nerdy stuff. I think it's for you.
So if you want to go into and share your screen, and I'll put it up on the screen for you.
All right, my screen is up. Hey, I can see myself and I can see the screen. That's fantastic. I just got dual monitors about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Nice. So makes life a little bit easier.
From here.
All right, guys. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being part of the presentation. I know you're taking a little bit out of your day in order to be here, and I just want to say how thankful I am for that. So as we talked about before, let me get something set up real quick, get the pointer set up. This is a focus stacking class, and this isn't the answer to everything. So, there's people with more experience focus stacking wise than I have. I do use it probably 10 to 20% of the time when I want to create a larger depth of field. But, I'm not going to go into perspective blending. I'm not going to go into, panoramic images using the focus stack with HDR built into it. This is really just a starting point. So we're going to go a little bit over my recommendations in terms of settings that I encounter when I use my camera, and some of the options that you might be able to apply when you're using it on the computer. I know, Mike, you said you had some issues. I will be honest, when I was working on this, I took a 180 image focus stack the other day, and I had Photoshop crash on me probably about 6 times. So I've got some workarounds that will maybe be able to help you out. So those who don't know me, my name is Christopher Gilbert. I am a Fujifilm product technical specialist. I've been with them a little over 2 years now. And my job is just to be out here educating people not only about photography, because that's really what we care about. Obviously, we care, we want to share our love with photography, and we do that through our cameras. But we want to share our knowledge as well, and some of the things that we've learned over, the 81 years that we've been around as a company. So my job as an educator is just to find topics that people are struggling on and kind of give you a little insight. I am a landscape photographer, so some of the approaches that we're going to be taking today is going to be landscape oriented, because that's where I think I excel at. Maybe not everybody does, but at least I do. So I cover quite a bit of the US now that COVID has happened. It used to be only around 20 to 30%, and now it's 100%. All of the techs here really just help each other out and bring up new topics. So if you guys have any topics that you're really wanting to learn and you need some help with, let TJ know, let us know in the comments there, and we can expand our base in terms of the classes that we can provide you with Fujifilm. So, like I said before, this class is really just the basic fundamentals, and we'll get into some of the options on how we set up my camera, and we can apply that towards your camera too, because most of these settings that we have in here are going to be, pretty much universal. How I set it up might be slightly different depending on the manufacturer. Not everyone has focus stacking ability within their camera, but setting up this will kind of give you an idea what you need to do in order to kind of get it set up on your camera. So we're going to try to build a larger depth of field as a byproduct of this, and that's ultimately the goal of focus stacking, and I'll get into it in the next couple of slides. So the synopsis of this entire class, so basically we're going to do the what and the why. So we're going to define what focus stacking is, why it is important, and then we're going to go into the how of it. So the why is where we get a little bit nerdy, because focus stacking isn't essential all the time. And it definitely takes more time than just getting one image straight out of the camera. And usually that's what I try to do. It's when you have that element, whether you're too close to your subject or you got too large of a depth of field because your foreground and infinity is just too far apart to get it in one shot. That's where really focus stacking is going to get involved. So we're going to go over the equipment that I use. We're going to go over the application in terms of making those images. That's really where I'm going to talk about how I do it in the camera. And last but not least, I do have Photoshop Doc open up here. And so we'll be able to see some of the processes. And I promise I'm not going to make you sit here. Once my computer aligns all these images, stacks them all correctly, everything's already set up. So we're not going to put that into your time. So we're going to get nerdy right off the bat, and we're going to talk about the what and the why. So focus stacking is really set up to create a larger depth of field, like I mentioned before, than what is traditionally available with a single image. And so there are other alternatives to that, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. But traditionally, I'm taking multiple images, and the camera is shifting focus slightly or largely, depending on how you set it up. And in post being whatever software that you choose to use, that's going to allow you to stack said images. Now, there are a lot of issues that could potentially happen. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But this is a great tool if you're struggling with near focus to far focus sharpness. That's really the benefit of this. I'm able to use wider apertures. This allows me to lower my film speed if I need to, or my ISO, so I'm going to get a cleaner image quality as a byproduct of that. And it really allows me to maximize my depth of field beyond, trying to stop down to f22, which is not ideal by any means, just not the best for image quality purposes. So this is why we choose to do focus stacking. I can't achieve it in one image. I can't maximize my depth of field with the aperture value that's appropriate. And so I'm having to rely on software in this case in order to do that. And so this is the what. And so here are the options in terms of the next couple slides, why we have to do focus stacking and some alternatives to focus stacking if we have to get to that point where we're going to. And so this is where we get nerdy right off the bat. So I'm talking about, my direction to my subject and my depth of field. So traditionally, your depth of field is going to be perpendicular to what your focus is, right? So it's not going to be slanted. It's not going to be this way. It's typically straight lines and you're shooting straight to it. So traditionally, when I'm photographing a very small subject, since my depth of field is perpendicular to how I'm shooting, there is a large potential to have fall off of my focus. Meaning that if we look here at this watch that I borrowed from Google Images, thank you so much for allowing me to have the rights to do that. They have that sort feature now. So if we look here, the front of that watch there is out of focus. And I'm not having any sort of settings on here because this is really just arbitrary to show my point. So if I'm photographing that subject at an angle, and this is how I'm shooting, my depth of field might start here, but I still have this point right here that I want it in focus as well, right? So there are ways around that, but that might not be your intention. And this is really where focus stacking is going to help you out. So if I want to get more in focus right off the bat without using any software whatsoever, strictly just changing my position to the subject, what if I match my subject in terms of angle? My subject is angled like this. I can point my camera down like this. And remember, my depth of field is perpendicular to where I'm at. So instead of my depth of field starting here, it starts above my subject. So that front face of the watch now is all going to be in focus for this particular shot. Now, you can see the back part of the watch isn't in focus whatsoever, right? So if you care about that, focus stacking still might be appropriate. If you don't care about that, you have now gained the opportunity to get an entire subject in focus, and that was your original intention. So this is just the macro aspect. For landscapes, that's really why tilt shift lenses were introduced. I can get a larger depth of field by angling the front of that lens and matching the plane of focus. What if I'm photographing it, let's just say to make my life a lot easier, an explanation, what if I have a hill like this? And of course, I'm using the angle again. What if I want to keep my camera straight just for perspective reasons? And now I can use that lens to move downwards or upwards in order to match the plane of focus to enlarge my depth of field. And so with that, you had your 8x10s, your 4x5 cameras, and that's really where you're going to use, tilt and swing in order to match that plane of focus to maximize your depth of field. So merely just reorienting yourself to your subject will allow you to get a larger depth of field already, so you're not reliant on focus stacking. So let's look at some images. These aren't my images, but they are shared by one of our Fujifilm techs. So if we look here, we're using focus stacking to increase that depth of field. So the single images on the left-hand side, I know it's a little bit dark, but I raised the brightness just so you can see the smaller images there. So the foreground detail over here, let's see, there we go. I have this big mouse pad, so it makes it hard to find my mouse sometimes. So there is so much more detail on the stack portion of that than there is on the single portion. So there is a technique that we'll get into in the next couple of slides called hyperfocal distance. And I know this isn't what the class is about, but this is what's going to differentiating, maximizing your depth of field in a single exposure versus relying on multiple exposures. So if you look here, Justin has tried to maximize his depth of field in a single exposure, using of our equipment, and I'll show you how on Fujifilm cameras how to do that without any guesswork. And here in the other image, he's using a GFX 50S, and he's taking multiple images using the focus bracketing options within our cameras and fusing those together to create a larger depth of field and also getting optimal sharpness. And that's the ultimate point on this. Sharpness is gained by choosing a better aperture rather than one that's reliant on a larger depth of field. Meaning that, I might have this much in focus that I need it to get, but I'm having to increase the aperture value so high, I'm now getting what's called diffraction. I've decreased the opening in the lens so much, it's actually bending light and how it actually interacts with your sensor. It's basically light is bouncing off one another, softening of an image to make it simplistic. So sharpness is definitely one portion of it. So you can really see the difference on this. This is noticeably different in terms of sharpness. This is just a portion, 100% of the foreground here. So my point is on this particular slide, on the smaller images on the last one, you couldn't really tell the difference. So do I have to focus stack for a landscape image when I'm merely just posting this on the web? Probably not, unless my subject is really close to the foreground and I have something small that I want to exaggerate the detail on. So for most situations, taking that large resolution and shrinking it down, and we've encountered this before, something looks really great on the back of your screen and you bring it on your computer, 27-inch monitor or something like that, and it's soft. That's because you're taking this huge image and shrinking it down. Same premise on the web, right? So, if I'm just presenting this on the web, I'm probably not going to focus stack unless I'm doing, say, a macro shot. Macro is a little bit different in terms of sharpness, just because it's going to be noticeable where my depth of field starts and ends because you're so close to your subject. So let's get all nerdy about lens sharpness. If you haven't gone to the site, imaging-resource.com, this is a great tool, and I've actually created links on here that I could click and show you, but for ease of use purposes, I don't want to have it kick out and go to a different screen right now. Basically, what I can do with these particular graphs, and I know this is pretty nerdy, so for a prime lens, which is two of these lenses, the 16 and the 60, all you're going to do is change aperture value. So you'll see the slide rule on the left-hand slide that I can slide up and down. That allows me to choose an aperture value, and this graph is going to show you how sharp it could potentially be. As I increase the aperture, if I have a really wide aperture lens, you'll notice that the sides will kind of flatten a little bit, because typically what happens is when you shoot with a wide aperture lens, the corners are softer than the center until you stop down maybe to, if it's a 1.4 lens, maybe 2, maybe 2.8, something along those lines. Now the zoom lens in the center, this is our 10 to 24. This is a great option. I now have the option to change aperture value as well as focal length being on the bottom of the graph there. So I can go 10 to 24 and see how this graph actually kind of flexes. And what you're looking for is flatness and hopefully something towards the purple area. And what's nice about this, and I left some of the lenses without any change. You can see the 16 millimeter 1.4, I put the 5.6. That's a flat, sharp as can be lens if you look at that graph. Now look at the middle one and the right one. The 60 millimeter 2.4, that's sharp, wide open. That's fantastic. The 10 to 24 here, once again, sharp, wide open. This is ultimately what led me to go with Fujifilm to begin with. 80 years worth of lens making experience over the course of multiple different platforms, 8x10, 4x5. We got medium format in all different aspect ratios, digital APS-C. We had a partnership with Nikon for a little while when we were making mirrored cameras, and we have, large format, GFX now. So we're using all our Fujinon expertise with not only our broadcasting lenses, but the large and medium format lenses that we've developed over these years. The reason why I'm telling you this is, if we look at this middle graph, if it's sharp wide open, I don't have to stop down at all whatsoever to get edge-to-edge sharpness. It might improve at 5.6, but it's not essential. Now, what's nice about this is you can also see diffraction taking place once you go to this website. Again, it's imaging-resources you can see on the screen. If I go to f22 on an APS-C camera, this graph will start rising up into the blue. You're getting a softness of the image. Now, blue is still really, really good. So if these lenses can handle diffraction like that, that's fantastic. That's really what you're looking for. And so you will see, based on your sensor size, when diffraction is going to hit. So if you're using a smaller than an APS-C sensor, you might see diffraction hit at maybe f11. If you're using a larger sensor, maybe a 35 millimeter sensor, you might see diffraction hit at f16 or f18. If you're using our GFX, I've pumped it all the way to f26, something ridiculous, and still no diffraction. And the reason why I tell you this is this allows you to determine what is the most appropriate aperture value that I'm going to choose for focus stacking circumstances. So, any one of these I can use at almost wide open aperture in order to do that. I don't necessarily want to, because, usually with standard shooting, say landscape shooting, I'm choosing an aperture value based on how large of a depth of field I want to create. And that's the distance between my foreground subject and my background subject. And that's really how I determine what aperture value to use. This is going to be a little bit different. Don't think in terms of depth of field. Think in terms of pictures, how many pictures I'm going to take. So the higher the aperture number I'm going to use, the less pictures I have to take, right? But the longer the exposure is going to be, right? Because I'm stopping down, essentially, making that opening in smaller. It's a little weird to think about it that way because we're so used to revolving around depth of field, and we're really reliant on the post-processing portion to create that larger depth of field. So, with macro shots, you might not want to shoot at f2.4. Mike might have experienced this. You're going to take thousands of images. I mean, so many, it's not even funny. So with those lenses, macro lenses in a macro experience, shooting very close to my subject, I'm still going to stop down to like f8, f11, just so I can minimize those images that I'm going to take. I don't want to take 1,000 images because, like Mike said, Photoshop is going to be real pissed as a byproduct of that. So another purpose of maximizing my depth of field, as you can see here, I'm very close to my subject. Justin was nice enough to offer me this image again. So on the left-hand image, you have the front part of that pine cone, which is tack sharp. The back of it is soft. Even using maximum apertures of like f22, really close to your subject, your depth of field is so small. And so using this focus stacking technique will really help you out. And so we offer that in camera rather than having to do that manually. So the two real purposes of focus stacking is to create that sharpness front to back and maximizing your depth of field for detail purposes. So let's talk about a little bit in terms of landscape. And I know I had this shot in my landscape class, but traditionally wider angles, and we'll just say instead of traditionally, wider angles will have a larger depth of field with a similar aperture value. So really you're going to be reliant on how close is my foreground subject. And so if my foreground subject is extremely close to the camera, I can't even get this to focus anymore. That's when you're going to be relying on focus stacking. If my subject is still 2 or 3 feet away, I might be able to get that shot with a wide angle lens. I won't have to rely on focus stacking. But if we look at these other images here and see how my relationship is to my subject, as you zoom in essentially, and I'm backing off and zooming at the same time so the subject itself stays close to the same amount within the frame, the background's appearing closer to the foreground. And that's really just based on proximity to subject. So you can see, maybe you can't see, but the background is, soft now. It's not as sharp as it is with the far image. I don't know why I'm pointing at my screen. You can't see it. There we go. With the 16 millimeter lens, my background is sharp at probably f11 or f16 that I shot this with. And, f11 or f16 is going to look different the more I zoom in, right? Depth of field completely changes depending on distance to subject, aperture value, sensor size. And the reason why I'm telling you this is the why I have to use focus stacking, because of these situations. Now, if you don't want to shoot a wide angle because your purpose is to create a relationship between the foreground and the background, and you can't get it with a number of, with a single exposure, focus stacking is really what's going to help you out with this. So I was talking before about how to get images in a single exposure. And we're going to look at this in the next slide in just a second. But you can see when I was talking about before how depth of field changes based on what focal length that you're using. So a 10mm lens, and this is all an APS-C camera, so your 10 is like a 15, a 55 is closer to like an 82, 83. At 3 feet right here, you can see that I have a pretty decent depth of field. So, and you can see that the blue is going to be your depth of field on the shot, and the white is going to be your focus distance, where essentially your camera is starting its focus at. So the further away my subject is, the larger my depth of field is, as long as I move that focus distance to that point. So depth of field expands as the subject is further away from you, and it contracts as the subject is closer to you with a similar aperture value. And you can see that with the lens focal lengths too. So if I look at the 24mm and I look down here at my depth of field, I have changed no settings whatsoever other than focus distance. My depth of field decreases the more I zoom in, right? So you have a higher probability of requiring focus stacking to get a larger depth of field the longer the focal length. Makes sense, right? So this is what I was talking about versus single versus multiple shots. So this is what made me switch to Fujifilm to begin with. And this is a distance scale present on your camera, so you can see where your camera is, visually focused and that depth of field that surrounds it. So I no longer have to guess. I literally don't autofocus for a lot of my shots, almost all of my shots landscape-wise, because of this reading. I can tell at certain aperture values what depth of field I'm getting based off aperture value, based off distance to subject, and I can really maximize my depth of field. If we look in this particular portion of the image here, this endpoint that's right on 30 feet, I just put there for convenience. If I move my focus just back just a little bit, but this blue portion all the way up to infinity, I'm going to assume, I can't remember what lens I used, maybe the 16mm, probably the 10 to 24 just to show you. I now have the maximum depth of field possible that I can get in a single exposure with this particular lens, this particular aperture value. Now, this is an absolute sharpness, and this is really where the difference is going to take place. And so this is acceptable sharpness versus absolute sharpness, and that's going to be determined on what I'm going to do with my image. So once again, like I talked about before, on the web, small print, don't matter. Taking that information, shrinking it down. If I'm making an enlargement, 20 by 30, 16 by 24, this is where you're going to start noticing softness in certain areas. I might not have sharpness in the corners. I've just shot 22 just to prove my point for depth of field, but I might not have sharpness in the corners that I need to with this technique. So focus stacking will help you choose a more, a wider aperture, allow me to go through the entire range of focus in order for me to build that, in order to create that sharp and larger depth of field. So some things you have to worry about when you're using a lens. And so this is going to be more noticeable the closer you are to your subject, and that's going to be focus breathing. Focus breathing is where you go from near focus to infinity, and you have a slight bit of field of view change. And so you can actually see it on this particular shot that I've taken in Colorado. So I focused right here on the leaves right here, and on this particular shot, I focused all the way to infinity. And you can see this little knot right here is in a completely different place from near focus to far focus. And that's because of how drastic my change in distance is. If I'm just focusing here maybe, I might not see that focus breathing as much. But if I'm having that huge depth of field, it's going to be extremely obvious. And that's ultimately, get my camera out of the way real quick. That's ultimately why they create cinema lenses. If I'm doing a focus pull, this is just an 18 to 55 lens. And so if I grab the other 18 to 55 lens, that's the difference between these two. You know, same focal length, you know, this has a little wider aperture, but this is designed not to breathe. So when I'm doing a focus pull from near focus to far focus, I should see little to no change in field of view. And so why is this important? So if we go to the next slide here, I've, you know, merged these together in Photoshop. I have lost some of my image as a byproduct of that. So, you know, covering the near focus to far focus range, because of that field of view change, I'm having no data right here whatsoever that's going to be in focus that it can merge together. So it's going to look like it's clipping. So you can even see this here. So I've lost a portion of my image right here with the alignment that I've made, and ultimately I've had to crop this out. So why I'm telling you this is, if you're encountering a lot of focus breathing, and just give it a try. If you haven't experienced before, you haven't seen it before, take a shot near focus, the minimum distance of the lens. I recommend using a wider angle lens. You're really going to notice it with that. Then go all the way to infinity and compare those shots side by side and see if you can notice any field of view change. And so with this in mind, when you're focus stacking, when you're creating your composition, don't put your subject or the thing you want most critically sharp or draw attention to near the edge. Otherwise, you're going to lose it in post when you crop it out. So for me, I always use a little bit of a buffer and put that around the edge. I just anticipate that I'm going to lose that. So, you know, if I generally put my image towards the bottom right or into the right or left, I'm just going to give a little bit of breathing room so I can anticipate that in post, I'm going to lose that. And if you still have a little bit of space that you can work with in post, sweet. You can create a tighter composition by eliminating some of that or cropping some of it out. So keep that in mind. So let's go to the equipment portion. I'm going to grab a little bit of coffee real quick. Have my 9,000 cups a day. So what am I using? So the new Fujifilm X-T4. The reason why I use this is because we offer a new focus stacking technique in camera that makes my life a lot easier. So I use the 80mm macro, I use the 10-24, that's our wide angle lens, and also the 16-55. That's just a good all-arounder that covers most situations that I'm going to encounter. So whatever lens that you choose to use, that's totally fine. I just use this because it's the normal focal lengths that I like. You know, I have the 60mm macro, but I choose to use the 80mm macro. I just like the sharpness of that a little bit better. Also, the focus ring just tends to be a little bit smoother when I'm creating that focus stack when I'm doing a certain technique in our cameras. So tripod, this is huge. You know, you want a stable tripod, absolutely stable. So you don't want the camera to move whatsoever, or once again, you're going to lose a portion of your image. So it doesn't matter the brand. More importantly is the fact that it's stable. One thing I do like, and I bought this from Pixel Connection, is the Aquatech leveling base. This has saved my butt plenty of times. All this does is allow you to set up your sticks really quickly. I don't know why I had 4 of them all of a sudden. And here's your ball head. I can move this leveling base just a little bit so I can throw down my sticks really quickly, and I can level it if it's not 100% level with a certain point. That makes it easier for me to adjust on the fly my horizon line when I'm doing my landscapes. Macro, it allows you to fine tune it just slightly. Hands down, it's worth it. Highly recommend it. You know, it's a little expensive. You're going to spend 140, 150 bucks, but if you're using a tripod almost exclusively, this has saved me minutes trying to get this set up because I'm not screwing around with each leg individually. So really right stuff ball head, doesn't really matter on that. That's just what I've had over the portion of the time. So the only thing that I do care about, and I really do like, and I know a lot of manufacturers are starting to do this. So on this head right here, there's 2 positions that this can lock. So I have fully clamped, I have open. That still allows me to move the camera front and back just a little bit, but it doesn't let it fall off. And then it has fully open and I can release it. The reason why I like this is I use a nodal rail, which allows me to create panoramic images without any sort of parallax issues. Or, you know, you've seen it before. You're trying to create a pano in Photoshop and you get this, or you get this bowing, right? And so this allows me to move that camera front or back to the best of my ability to eliminate any sort of parallax issues that I'm going to have. And I'm going to have more data to stitch together in Photoshop. And so I'm also lazy, so this doubles as my macro rail, and that's ultimately why I use this 2-lock kit. I even, I have it back here. You won't be able to see it just because it's a little bit dark, but I can basically unclip and move that camera front and back anywhere I put it. That's important to me. L bracket, doesn't matter the brand. I use small rig just because that was the first one that came out for the X-T4 before it was announced. These lighting kits, all it is a little Lightrotorch 2.0. I use 2 of these. They're really great. They come with a little diffusion cap. All it is a piece of rubber, and I use that to accentuate certain portions of the image in my macro shots. I don't necessarily use them for landscape. And I'm just using a GorillaPod in order to keep that up in a certain position if I want to keep it consistent, because when I'm stacking images, lighting is crucial because you don't want to see that fluctuation. So let's get into some of the nerdy aspects of what I recommend setting when you're approaching this. And so first we're going to talk about shutter type. And so shutter, basically, we're all used to that. That's how your camera takes the picture itself. It opens and closes. So your mechanical shutter, you have 2 physical pieces within your camera, a front curtain and a back curtain, and that's closing and opening, right? Great for almost everything. For focus stacking, not so much. And the reason for that is you're more likely to have to use a delay in between your shots because you'll get what's called shutter shock. And that's when the camera is physically moving because of the shutter. Now the X-T4 has been dampened to the nth degree, so I'm less likely to have to change to another shutter type, but I still err on the side of caution. So electronic shutter, this is really great. It's basically turning on and off the sensor, and it does it in a readout almost. So think of it like a swipe from top to bottom. So you're not going to hear a click whatsoever. It's virtually silent. I use this every once in a while, but if you're using the lighting situation that I recommended, or any sort of LED lighting, you're going to see a lot of flicker. Electronic shutter really doesn't handle flicker. So you're going to see some exposure differences if your exposure matches up with the recycle time of the lights that you have, which is usually 60 hertz. It recycles 60 times for every second. So when I take my shots and I have an electronic shutter to make it more quick, I'm going to see some flicker action, dark, bright. And this really isn't advantageous when you're stitching these images together in Photoshop. So I use electronic front curtain. So this is the best thing I've discovered to use for macro or for landscape because it uses a hybrid of the 2. So I'm using the first portion electronically and I'm ending the exposure mechanically. So when my image starts, it basically is taking the swipe electronically like the readout, and it's finishing that exposure mechanically. And the reason why it can finish at the end is because if you're taking an image at the end of that, you're not going to get any camera shake whatsoever. There's my baby you can hear in the background. So I choose to do this in most situations. The only time that I don't use electronic front curtain and I stick with electronic shutter is typically when I'm outdoor taking macro shots where I'm not adding additional lighting to the scene. So I can get through my exposures extremely fast. So I recommend look and see if you have this feature on your camera. Electronic front curtain is your best friend. So let's dive into Fujifilm, as they say, a little bit. So we have 2 bracketing options. We have our old school one and we have our new school one. So one's manual and one's called auto. And everyone says, oh, auto, why would I want to do that? I strictly shoot manual. And I will be honest, auto has been the best bet for me because I can delineate where to start and where to stop. And this will make sense on the next couple of slides. So for the manual option, I have 3 options that I have to change. And this is the same for almost every manufacturer unless they just build it in camera. I'm going to have the number of frames I'm going to take, the steps, and the interval. And so I'll describe what they are. So frames, that's obvious, right? How many pictures I'm going to take. Step is the increment that it's going to change focus. And this is going to solely be dependent on how close I am to my subject. The closer I am to my subject, the smaller the changes I want to be. So in Fujifilm, they're called steps, and steps are calculated dependent on your distance to your closest subject, the furthest subject, what angle of view you're using, and what aperture value you're using. So it's all calculated. So there isn't a definitive how much of a step it's going to move. We don't know. Well, we do know, but I don't want to guess. So long story short, to make this simplified, if you choose to do manual, 1 small step, 10 big step. I usually hover around 5 or 6 for landscape. For macro, I hover around 2 or 3, small increments. So the last is the interval, and that's just the time frame between shots. So this is going to change dependent on what type of shutter I'm going to use, how much motion there is within my image. If I shoot in a landscape with a lot of wind, well, I better have almost no interval whatsoever. Maybe I don't have one and I'm using electronic front curtain. I should do pretty fairly well with that. So if I'm taking a macro shot outdoors, 0 interval, I'm just going to let the camera use electronic shutter and just go through that really quickly. So let's talk about the auto option. Honestly, this is what I use. I love this setup. It's fantastic. So the interval is going to be given to you at the beginning of the option. And so it fluctuates between 0 and 10 seconds. That's just the delay between each individual shot, right? And for me, I'm hovering around 0 to 1 because I'm using electronic front curtain. And now I'm in manual focus, and I'm on my point A, I'm choosing the closest focus possible. And I recommend use our dual display here. So wherever this focus point is, I'm going to get an enlargement on the right-hand side of that or the left-hand side of it, depending on how you have it set up. This allows me to check critical focus, or I can just punch in on the back and do it that way if you want to do that traditionally. And so I've selected my closest subject, and I'm going to hit the menu button, which is menu OK, and that goes to B, which is my furthest subject. And I could switch it back and forth if I wanted to. I don't traditionally. I haven't really even tried it. So A close, B far. We'll just make it simple. And so for landscapes, traditionally, I'm setting B all the way to infinity. That's fine. I want a close focus all the way to far focus. When I'm doing macro, it's really dependent on where I want that fall off. So I can choose the endpoint of, say, if I'm taking a picture of a bowl of fruit, I can choose the endpoint of the fruit to have sharp, and it's actually going to calculate the number of pictures for you. All I got to do is hit the shutter button, and it's ready to go. I highly recommend, and you'll discover this in the next couple of slides, I highly recommend start off with that 2-second timer. Otherwise, you're going to get that motion when you're taking the shot, and your first shot is a waste. And so not as critical for landscape, because you will have some throwaway images once we get into Photoshop in the next little bit. But it is critical for me for absolute sharpness. So for macro settings, let's talk about this in terms of what options I use within my camera. So RAW or JPEG, solely dependent on the amount of pictures that I'm going to take. So if I'm only taking maybe 5 or 6 pictures, I'm going to shoot RAW, and I'm going to change all the options that I want on here. I'm going to shoot highlight, shadows, noise reduction, all that jazz. We know that. If I am doing 180 pictures, I'm sorry, I'm shooting JPEG. I don't have enough time in the day in order to handle those files, because our files are huge in comparison to some of the other manufacturers in terms of data. I'm looking at 30, 40 megabytes on a 26 megapixel camera. That's insane. And over the course of 180 pictures, I'm good. I'm not going to do that. But I highly recommend, if you don't have a UHS-2 card in any of our newer cameras, XT3, XT4, XT2, X Pro 3, any of those that have the UHS-2 capability, buy one. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting for your camera. And if you're taking enough pictures and you're shooting in RAW because you want to, there might be a delay if you're taking electronic shutter, especially, where it's just popping through those images. So buy the fastest card that your camera is capable of. If you're shooting a different manufacturer, go to their website, look at their card capacity capability, and if it doesn't accept UHS-2 cards, don't buy one. You're going to waste your money. Buy the fastest card that's appropriate. If it can only accept a U3 card, buy a U3 card that's 95 megabits per second. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to choose the appropriate settings. So let's look at this. So if there's subject movement, I'm going to choose a higher ISO, hands down. I want to take a shorter exposure as a byproduct of that. You know, aperture value wise, once again, I'm looking at it for sharpness reasons, like I showed you in the graphs, but I'm looking at it as how many pictures I'm going to take. And that's, like I said, really interesting. So as I increase that aperture number and maximize my depth of field, those number of pictures decrease. And that's what I've done in macro shots. If I shoot at f4 or at 5.6, get ready to hang out in your computer room for a long time. So like I said before, 2-second time delay. I'm going to choose manual focus. And electronic front curtain, if I'm going to use LED lights in order to light my subject, because I don't want to get that flicker in between shots. And electronic shutter, outdoors, no artificial lighting whatsoever. And subject movement, if that is critical, if there's potential for it, I'm just going to go to electronic shutter just to breeze through those. And I've done that before with our GFX 100 camera, where I'm taking 400 megabyte images, and I put it on electronic shutter, and I clogged that buffer for like 10 minutes. It was way too much, so just keep that in mind. So for me, I choose autofocus bracket. I choose 0 or 1. I'm not going to have a lot of subject movement. I set A for the closest subject, B for the furthest subject, and I just go out and have a cup of coffee once it starts. And so in this particular shot in my room, it was only 23 pictures because I'm at f8, but I tried f2 just for grins, and I ended up with 180. So for landscape, so RAW or JPEG, for JPEG situations, if I'm not going to do any editing whatsoever, it's real critical that I get my exposure right on. So choose the film simulation that you want, or color profile, whatever manufacturer you're shooting. And, look at your histogram, because that's what your histogram is reading out. If you are shooting RAW on our cameras, go to natural live view. That's going to strip those JPEG properties straight from the camera, give you a more true histogram to what it's going to look like when you go into post. So let's break down these settings, and they're going to look very similar. So I'm going to look for motion blur, just like I did before. More motion blur, higher ISO to get a faster shutter speed. Choose aperture based on sharpness, just like before. Think of it, how many pictures I want to take. And for this, I will be honest, I could shoot at f5.6, but I'm still getting tack sharp images at f8. So even at f8, I'm getting 17 images sometimes, depending on the angle of the lens that I'm using and depending on my close distance to far distance. 2-second delay, always have that. I always find that I bump my camera just accidentally, and 2 seconds gives it enough time to settle. And manual focus again and again, electronic front and curtain almost every single time. That just eliminates any potential for camera shake. Same thing as beforehand. I'm looking at close, I'm looking at the interval 0 to 1. I'm doing close focus, far focus. And once again, that image is going to be all the way at the end. Sorry, the image is going to be numbered all the way on the top right-hand corner. So, computer prep. Mike, this is what's going to help you out. So, for me, and I recommend looking at Pixel Connection, see what sort of SSDs they have. SSDs are so cheap. I have an Extreme Pro fast SSD, and I can actually use my SSD. I have it just plugged into my, 3.0 super speed port, USB port. I use that as my scratch disk. My scratch disk is the temporary storage that Photoshop uses in order to put this stuff together, essentially. And it can use a lot depending on what you're using to put together. So that 180 images that I was trying to put together, that took 900 times because it crashed every single time, it used 40 gigabytes of scratch disk space in order to put that together, and I didn't have that on my internal SSD, so it physically stopped, and I'd have to start again. It took me a couple times to figure out what the heck was going on. So now I choose to use my external solid-state SSD as my scratch disk. So I'm having Photoshop use this blank SSD drive to basically put anything together, and this has made my time frame in terms of editing my photos so much faster. So I'm using this scratch disk to align my images, to save my images, and you don't have to buy an SSD. If you got a portable, if you got an internal hard drive that you're not using that's really fast, because not all hard drives are made the same, right? Especially the spinning ones. Your RPMs is going to dictate how fast that information is pulled or written. So for me, I chose the SSD because, I got for 130 bucks. It's only a 512 gig. I can use that to the nth degree, and once I'm done, it's temporary data. It's going to get wiped. So I have a blank SSD again. So be prepared to wait. Just anticipate it. So when I was doing the 180 shot to prep for this presentation, I reduced the file size to 1 megabyte, 1 megapixel, just so I could show you all the individual images put together. So I went out this morning, I shot an image just for fun, just to kind of put it together, and it's only 17 images rather than 180, and it makes it much easier to deal with. So again, anticipate. Am I going to do this for web? Reduce to 4 to 6 megapixels. It's fine. If you're going to make an enlargement, yeah, you're going to have to rely on a lot of scratch disk space in order to do that. And I have a dedicated graphics card in order to handle this. I have a GPU handling this information graphically to take a little bit of load off my CPU to allow it to cycle through this a little bit more quickly. So once you're done, I typically save first, and still it's using that scratch space. And I basically close out my file. I open up, I'm using Windows. If you're using Mac, that's fine, it doesn't matter. But I can just see I have my Windows Explorer open that shows me all my hard drives. And as soon as I close out that file, boom, that scratch space is gone. And I can open up my file again and use that scratch space again. So that's a little technique that you can use. Or if you're encountering these issues where you're not having enough data, you don't have enough space there to handle that, break it into sections. So, maybe I can take, if I have 80 images, maybe I can break it up into, close to 30, 23 and a half. I don't remember which one. And just, align those images, stack those images, and have each one in individual groups. That'll save you a lot of time in Photoshop. And if you're having that scratch disk space, it just gives you that capability to save individually, so you're not having to recreate this over and over and over again. Because trust me, you don't want to wait half an hour multiple times in order to get this set up. So prior to Photoshop, and you know what? I'm just going to exit out here, and let's just dive straight into Lightroom real quick. Let's see if I can get this to work. A lot of the times I don't. So hey, there's a handsome man right there.
Hello, so much good information.
So I'm going to exit out on this side, and I'm going to go to my Lightroom real quick, and I'm going to share again. Let's see. Boom.
And real quick, while you're doing that, Mike Robel's been putting some good comments in there. I love the Fuji focus distance scale. Like Chris said, it changed how I focus for landscape and architecture shots. Another great value add for Fuji. I had no idea that imaging resource let you click on the lab test results. I think I'm going to fall down a rabbit hole this afafternoon.
Mike, I'm so sorry.
For some reason, when I read those lab test results, I just automatically thought Maury Povich. I don't know why. But
when I
you are in focus. And,
when I was shooting another manufacturer, I literally sat there for a month going through each individual one. Sorry. All right. I think my Lightroom is up.
We're good to go.
So you can see my images. I have all DNGs here. I'm using Lightroom just for this particular setup. Lightroom is not a big fan. Let's rephrase that. Adobe is not a big fan of your raw data. That's regardless of the manufacturer. Unless you start masking with the mask tool right here, sharpness is just over exaggerated. So I convert all my stuff to DNGs with a tool set that we can talk about. I don't want to take time out of this. So, with my first image right here that I have in the corner, I'm making all my adjustments based off here, right? So whatever I want it to look like, you can see that I brought up my exposure, almost 2 stops. I reduced highlights just slightly. I brought up shadows just slightly, and I moved my white and black point. So that's all I really did. I also reapplied my film simulation that I like. So, Adobe's color is okay. I can use the Adobe raw color schemes, but I like our color profiles. That's why I like shooting Fuji. And so I find that after I convert these to DNG, which is an Adobe format, a digital negative, it handles these colors a little bit more accurately. So let me close this. And so I've made my adjustments on the first image, right? So all I'm going to do is go to my copy settings. I know it's pretty small right here. So I'm copying all the settings that I have here. And you know what, for this particular shot, I can check none and just go into all the ones that I've done for ease of use. And for this, I'm just going to say check all, and I'm just going to, let me move this a little bit. I'm just going to do copy, and I'm going to apply all my changes to every single one of these images. And so for me, that makes it consistent. So I'm not going to have a fluctuation in color. I'm not going to have a fluctuation in highlight tone, shadow tone, contrast, whatever you're doing. So I have three close images in terms of overall brightness, contrast, blah, blah, blah. And so once these are all consistent, I can do a couple things. I can just select them all, and I can do right click again, and I can go to the stacking option here. And I could basically group these if I choose. And all group does is put them into a single file for ease of use when you're going and you're looking at your library. That's it. You know, for this particular setup, since the way I oriented this, you only will see the images that I want in here. I don't have to. But once these are stacked, I can right click again, and I can go over to my edit in option in Photoshop. I'm going to go all the way down to open in layers in Photoshop. And this might take a little bit of time. So to alleviate that, I'm going to go and stop sharing again. So that's just the Lightroom option of it. So again, keep in mind, make your adjustments, copy those adjustments, paste those adjustments for consistent files. You can stack those images by just grouping them together, and that just shows you the overall number of images that you have with the top image on top. And let's go over to, let's see, application window. Yay. All right. So let me move this just a little bit and click on that. Cool. So on this particular, let's pretend that all these images are opened up as layers now. So I have every single one of these. And so this will show all my individual focus. Boop. I know I can just cycle down and show this, but this is basically showing every single one of my images from near focus to far focus in individual layers. So what I want to do before I start anything is I want to make sure to align them. So if I do not align them, there is potential for what's called ghosting. Ghosting is just the artifacts that you're going to see within the image itself that potentially it moved over the course of the image making that you've done. So all I got to do, I got all my layers selected here. I can go to edit. I can go down to auto align. So once I do that, it gives me all these options. You know, I usually do lens correction. So vignette removal, geometric distortion removal, I check those, and I just hit OK. And so what this is going to do is overlay all your images together and make sure they're 100% straight. And if you see anything that's been wobbly, you know, maybe you had image stability turned on, you got a little bit of a focus shift as a byproduct of that, this is going to be removed once these are aligned. So let's go to the next portion, and that's going to be once these are all put together, I'm going to go down to auto blend. And so for me, I traditionally do stack images, and I can do seamless tones and colors, and I can use content aware if I lost any portion of my image. And you'll notice this once you do your alignment. So if you lost some of your images, top left, bottom, whatever, you know, you can ask Photoshop to kind of fill that in with pixel information. It works okay. Just know that you're going to increase the time frame of which it's actually going to process. So I'm not going to actually do this in front of you. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Perfect. So as you can see, this is now my image that I've now merged together. These are stacked. And so I'm going to turn this off. And this is my merged image on top here. And let's look at all this stuff down here. So some of these images, there wasn't even a bit of information pulled from here. So anything in black in Photoshop is masked out. Anything white is going to be visible. So if we look at these small portions, and this will make more sense once I make invisible this layer, you see how I don't have any information there? It has pulled that sharpness from that particular portion. So it has pulled that information there. It's pulled information here. And you can see slowly but surely it's building that depth of field with individual shots that I have here. And so once I get to infinity, suckers, you're having to go through all of this. Just kidding. So you can see I have 3 images that don't really have a lot of information there. So this is just basic space that was overlapped once it hit infinity. I don't really have to worry about that. I didn't use any of that, but if you ever notice that within your image, within your layers, it's just extra layers, doesn't matter. And so all that information there has created this image. So this image is front to back sharp. And if we compare it to this particular shot, so this is starting out, you know, all these individual shots to create this. So you'll, on this shot, I don't know if we can see, bring this hand up further. Let's get super nerdy. See how I lost a little bit on top here? So just like I was talking about, it's that focus breathing issue where the front of focus and that far focus was just too extreme, and I had focus breathing on that lens. So for me, I use this basically as my digital negative. So I can make all my alterations here, highlight shadows, if I use the luminosity masks, if I want to do any sort of, if I really wanted to get nerdy, I did take some multiple exposure ones in terms of I exposed for the foreground, then I exposed for the sky, and I can blend those together where I'm using 2 sets of focus stacking now with 2 different exposure differences to overlay that. But I don't want to get that nerdy in this particular portion of it. So when I have stuff like this, for me, I just crop it out. And so this is the final image that I came up with from those focus stacking that I took in the morning. So I can do my dodge and burning with this if I wanted to. And for me, traditionally, what I do when I want to finalize an image, I always run a high pass filter. This, all it does is exaggerate any sort of edges within it. And I actually create that high pass filter. I go into my blending option in terms of layer, and I'll choose either soft light or hard light. And you'll see that instantly come up. And you can choose with the opacity of that layer, how sharp you want it. And generally, I add it in vignette as well.
What's a high pass filter?
What high pass filter? Perfect. So let's just do this real quick.
If nobody knows what one is, what is a high pass filter?
Perfect. So I duplicated my layer here. All I did was Control J. So that duplicated this layer, and I'm going to make it look really crappy so we can see the difference. So with this, I go up to my filter, I go down to other, and I go down to high pass. And so with this high pass filter, I am going to go out a little bit, and you'll see here there is a little bit of information here, and you'll see kind of like edges of the image. Photoshop is trying to find these edges. And so let me see if I can bring, with the dual monitors, it makes it a little bit harder. There we go. So within my image itself, I'm going to find a whole bunch of edges, and this is the radius of pixel. Keep in mind, as I increase this radius, all it's doing is finding edges, so they're overlapping. So let's make this look like crap, which we did. Perfect. So I hit OK. Let me get my navigator out of the way again. And so all I'm doing is going down to my blending options within these layers, and I can choose soft light, hard light, and you can see a little bit of change. Well, actually, you can see a major change between these two. And so, again, this is just an additional sharpening technique that I use. So I'm going to choose hard light just for grins. Looks horrible, right? Just disgusting. So, but it's found those edges. And when you go too sharp, you've encountered it before. You're using basically all post-sharpening is basically changing contrast. So if something is soft, instead of being a solid color, a white or a black, it's like a gray, just for this example. So it tries to find those changes, and tries to make them more black or more white to have a little bit of difference in terms of color, and that contrast will give the illusion of sharpness. And so, as we can see here, this looks horrible, right? But I'm going to create a mask on this, and the benefit of using this high pass filter is now I can paint out anywhere I want. And I'm just going to change the opacity to 100. And so now I'm just painting it in black. And so that allows me to paint where I want most sharp. So what if you don't care about the sky in this instance? I can paint out the sky. I can paint it black, and you can see the change on here. And so I can get rid of the mask or reapply the mask real quick just to show you the differences. And so this allows you to be very specific as far as where you want it applied. And now the opacity filter up here allows me to choose the level. And so what if I want really sharp, but I only want a little bit of it, if that makes sense? So I can just reduce that, let's say 23%, and now that change is very, very subtle in comparison to the 100% that was really horrible. And so traditionally, I'm going through overlay, soft light, hard light, and I will be honest, our lenses are really sharp, and most manufacturers are. You'll know what's best for you, but I rarely go to hard light. I usually just use soft light because it's a slight, subtle difference. And keep in mind, when I go into Lightroom and you have that sharpness there, I'm doing none of that whatsoever because of how I converted my image within Lightroom itself. I'm using an external converter. It's called Iridiance X Transformer. It's just converting my raw files into a DNG, and it's applying the in-camera profiles automatically in terms of sharpness, vignette, distortion, things along those lines, and it's hooking those into the DNG right then and there. So I'm throwing away all of that stuff in Lightroom that causes these artifacts, and it's not just us, it's everybody. Until you actually mask out, and you've seen this when you're using Lightroom, where you have the option to mask your image and choose the, where you're hitting Alt and you're going with sharpness and seeing where it's applied and masking, just finding the edges. That works pretty well. But I find this just to be a little bit better technique for my style of shooting, because I am that guy that did this test with one of my images, and I went through so many different programs. I used Luminar with base settings. I used Capture One with base settings. I used ACR, Lightroom. I'm almost to a point where I'm going to start using our own raw converter Fujifilms just to see the difference. But I found, at least for Fujifilm files, that Iridiance X Transformer with the base settings produces better results than some of the other options that I've seen.
And I wanted to jump in too and say, just kind of call out the the Ohio Fujifilm group, because you posted a lot of the kind of the feedback that you've gotten and the tests that you've done with those software packages. And, I can't thank you enough. I think that opens up the light to other people, and to see that there is something else besides Adobe or, Apple Photos or whatever it is. And then you went through and actually gave it a side-by-side test. So thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So like TJ said, if you're not part of the Fujifilm already, go. It's Ohio-centric. I'm in there from time to time. TJ's in there, Matt's in there, Eeyore's in there. Pretty much everybody's in there. And so it's a great way not only to share your images, but if you're having issues, Doris, she's fantastic. She's one of the big Fuji fanatics that come to Pixel Connection all the time. She's having issues with her firmware. So she posted it in there. TJ kind of called me out and said, hey, can you help with this? And, I showed up the next day, had some solutions, and she got it taken care of. So if you're having issues, obviously we have the tech one-on-ones for you guys. That's completely free if you're wanting to discover what Fujifilm is about, or if you're having some issues or you want to discover more information, just ask TJ, Matt, anyone in Pixel Connection, Zach, they're all great people. So I know this was kind of nitty gritty, a lot of information right there in terms of why we would choose focus stacking. There are some issues, and this is what I'm going to wrap up with. And Mike, you might have encountered this before. I could open one of my TIFFs from my focus stacking with 180 images, but I don't really want to do that to you. That focus breathing issue especially for macro, can create some issues within your image. Meaning that just like the softness in certain areas where it happens in the corner for landscapes, it could happen within the center of your image, dependent on your close focus to far focus. Where I took a picture of the Lego guys within my presentation, and I had this halo of soft area around one of the Lego guys because of that focus breathing issue. And so the ways to get around that is where I'm going to go individually into my shots and see if I can pick and find one of those images, or potentially take another one if my camera hasn't moved, potentially in that focus range and with a larger aperture, and try to cover that range that I couldn't normally get. I'm going to basically mask it out in Photoshop, and mask in, this separate image that I've taken in that soft area. So I'm having to manually correct any sort of auto issues, because, if you only have 2 or 3 issues, you can manually do this. I can basically manually change 2 images in Photoshop and merge them together and use the painting technique that I showed you. It works great. When you're doing multiple images, that's where it's going to get a little problematic. So I just want to thank you, and I want to thank Pixel Connection for allowing me to do this. This was kind of the litmus test for this class, and this is a great resource for information. Thank you, Pixel Connection. You always have great classes, and you also always have great options for every camera manufacturer to offer, great instructors, our ex-photographers. You get great brands teaching great information. So hopefully everyone there learned something. Thanks, everybody. I'll get off my spiel.
We appreciate it, man. Thank you so much. And you bring up a really good point of, with the classes, we do have and actively scheduling even more now. Now that the store's back open, we will be having more in-person classes. So keep an eye out. If you go to our website, you can click on events, or it's thepixelconnection.com/ I want to say classes. Is that right, Gage? Is it /classes? Yep, /classes. And you can stay up to date on everything that we are doing in store. And we do this every Wednesday. So we try to provide some type of, class or, first look. And then also on Fridays, we cover the news in the week. So definitely tune in for that as well. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. Normally I would have some announcements, but honestly, this was just chock full of content, and I just want to leave it at that. I want it to it's all swimming around inside. So thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time today. I really appreciate all of your depth of knowledge and your geeky, nerdy knowledge. So thank you so much.
Thanks, TJ. I appreciate it.
I hope everyone has an awesome week. We'll see you.